Thank you very much, Carol, for the kind introduction. And hello, everybody. It's good to be back again and leading another workshop. So when we first kicked off on Monday, we looked at some of the psychological and spiritual effects because of COVID. And today, I'm going to be talking on a topic which has pulled lots of people apart. We've had lots of opinions across the world. And I've called it to vaccinate or not to vaccinate. That is a question, really. And I think it's, at the end of the day, it's for each of us to answer that. And I'll take you through a few thoughts as we go along. And I must say very clearly, I'm speaking for myself. And I speak with a clear conscience. And it's my hope and prayer that all of you will follow this and take it in the spirit of fellowship and as we meet together as God's people. So just a couple of disclosures, as I said on the very first day, that's where I work in Basildon in Essex in the Cardiothoracic Center. I'm a respiratory physician. For those in the US and elsewhere, it's to do with the lungs. I lead a few of the ventilation services in this region. Because I have been a chest doctor, a lung doctor, I have been right in the middle of the pandemic for the last 20 months. We've had in the UK at least, and across the world, we've had the first wave, we've had the second wave, and the third wave. I think that point number 3 is important. The first wave, we treated in my hospital itself about 250 patients who are very sick. In the second wave, we went up to 420. And the third wave, we have not crossed 25. And I think that's important as we go along today's workshop. And as I mentioned on the very first talk, I've witnessed a lot of patients dying, young people dying, older people dying. And it brings a lot of sadness because, as you know, families are not allowed into the hospital when you have COVID. So sometimes patients die on their own. And sometimes we've had to step in and just boldly hold hands. So after the pandemic as well, it's got a lot of problems, psychological and spiritual, for those who have been admitted and those who haven't. So I have seen it. I have worked with it. I'm still working with it. So I speak today really from my heart. And the second disclosure, as always, as a believer, as we've said right throughout the last 4 days and sessions, God is in control of this pandemic. And God is in control of everything. And it may be terrible, but God is in control.
Sweet.
Secondly, I think as a doctor, I'm very convinced that the greatest physician was our Lord Jesus Christ himself. And he taught us a very important lesson, not to be served, but to serve. And in the various places God has kept each of us. That is my hope and prayer for all of us. So those are my 2 disclosures. So what are we going to do in this workshop? Firstly, I'd like to look at some statistics. I'm a doctor. Statistics can lie, but often gives us a decent picture. And it's good that we look at some statistics very briefly. Secondly, I'd like to review what are the issues that people face when considering vaccines, all vaccines, because some of you would have heard about problems people have with other vaccines. In the UK, for example, there was a problem with, or some information about a vaccine which a lot of our children take, what's called as the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, which is used worldwide. And because of that disinformation, lots of people who believed that disinformation suffered. So we will look at these issues. Thirdly, as we go along, as I speak, ideally, it would have been wonderful if it's a face-to-face workshop, because I can ask questions, I can get feedback as we go along. But obviously, this is Zoom. It's the best we have. And I think the best way of doing things is if you send your questions directly to Carol, who will then feed them to me and I will answer them. Secondly, I would like you to think about the 3 questions I'm going to show in the next slide. And if you have any thoughts on that, please do send the information to Carol, and then I will show you what should be our perspective on those 3 questions. So these are the 3 questions. Firstly, how can the church identify first and support the congregation or the fellowship to take proper informed decisions on vaccinations? So what can the church do about that? And as you know, this has been a problem across the world. I will not mention specific countries or denominations, but this is a problem. So the question is, how can the church identify and support? The second big thing is, how can individuals, that's you and me and each of us in our work, at home, in our families, in our fellowships, in our neighborhood, how can we look at the information that is available and ask if it's trustworthy? Is it scientific? Is it morally correct? And very important for us as believers, is it spiritually correct? So that's the second question I want you to think about. And thirdly, what should be our attitude as Christians? You know, people make decisions. So what should be our attitude to those who take up vaccination and those who don't? Because it's very important we recognize there are people who have made different choices. So I think it's very useful to set the scene, and I'll just show some statistics, just 5 of them, but it's very simple and very easy to understand. This is the first statistic, and this is correct as of 9th August, which is last Monday, not last Monday, this Monday. And this is the worldwide statistics. So you can see, you know, currently, at least on Monday, there were close to 500,000 patients across the world. Sorry, new cases per day, that is, on the 9th. There were close to 202 million patients across the world with COVID. So far, over the last 20 months, just over 4 million people have died. But I want you to look at the 4th statistic. 4 billion people, just over 4 billion people have received vaccine doses. It could be double counted because sometimes this count goes for those who've had 2 vaccinations. So it includes all the number of vaccinations which have been given. So if you think about it, out of the 7 billion people we have on this planet, over half of them have had the vaccine. So that is the opening statistic. It's important because we're not talking about something which was given to 5 or 10 people, but to 4 billion people, or 4 billion doses. That's the right word. This is the current UK statistic, again, correct as of 8th August. So here, the first graph, it talks about, you know, after we had the second wave, we had, you know, the numbers went down. And then in July, suddenly there was a spike in patients. So that was the third wave. And the spike was on an average of, we used to have 50 to 55,000 patients per day. But look at the side, look at this graph. At the same time, the deaths sort of remained flat, maybe slightly went up from March, April. Why is this arrow there? That is when about a third of the population, in the third of the adults, that is, had their vaccinations in the UK. And I'm not sure if you know, in the UK at least, as in the rest of the world, the older, most vulnerable people were given the doses of the vaccine. I think that's important because vaccination is there and it's sort of flat, very slightly deaths increase, but look at this going up there. The last time we had 55 to 60,000 patients who had diagnosed a day, every day, we had close to 1,000 deaths in the UK every day. And there were close to, in our hospital, we had around 400 inpatients when we had 50,000 in the country. But as I said, there are only 20 to 25. In fact, today we had only 18 patients. So that is important in the context of what we're going to talk about. Again, some patients were admitted in July, more than that, but deaths did not go up very much. So that's the second statistic. This third one is looking at people who have been vaccinated. You know, I originally come from India. India has got 1.5 billion people. So compared to the rest of the world, at least this is, all these statistics are WHO statistics, World Health Organization. You know, close to 395 million people have had their vaccines. Some of the dark bar is the ones who got fully vaccinated, and the light green is the one who got partial, which means one dose. And obviously, the population is lower in the rest of the world, and lots of people are vaccinated as well. So this is going across. Hungary is here. As of 9th of August, close to 5.5 million people in Hungary were vaccinated. I can go down the rest of the statistic, but we won't. So just to say, lots and lots of people, as I said in the first slide, first statistic, 4 billion people, 4 billion doses have been given. So this is, again, there's another graph which says that China has given lots more people, but it is difficult to validate that. But China, lots more people compared to even India have had a dose of their vaccine. We won't talk about different vaccines, but just to say, lots of people in China have had vaccines as well. This is the fourth statistic. It talks about willingness to vaccinate. And I've just showed you a spectrum of countries. There's Germany there. There's Japan on the other side, the United States and France. So this is the light blue is people who, you know, want to get vaccinated, but they didn't get the chance. The sort of orange bars are the ones who are unvaccinated, but they're not sure. They're not certain if they want to get vaccinated. But I want you to look at this red bar. The red bar, this is as of July 15th. Those are the people who are not vaccinated and not willing to vaccinate. They don't want vaccinations. So it ranges from 15 to a third of the population. Okay, so it is important for you to know that there is a lot of people who don't want to get vaccinated. And if you look at Africa, for example, there'll be lots of people who want the vaccine, but they can't get the vaccine. But this is important for you to note. And the final slide, statistic, because it is important for us to understand this in the context of what I'm speaking. This is the big side effect of people who had vaccines. And this, you may have heard of it, clot in the brain causing problems. As of end of July, 73 people died in the UK. This is a UK statistic. And 411 people had the clot. I've personally seen at least 5 people, I think, who have had problems, but none had died. But I want you to put it in perspective, because people are scared that if you take the vaccine, you could die because of the side effect. As I said, close to 60 million doses have been given in the UK, of which about 40 million have had both doses. And the UK population is 67 or 68 million people. So for all that, people who got vaccinated, 73 died. That's something which is important in perspective. And as of yesterday, just under 130,000 people died with COVID in the UK, directly with COVID in the UK. So I think it's useful for us to look at this. I got one more thing. We talk about patients who have symptoms. You may be admitted, or you may stay at home with symptoms. You got headache, fever. Very few people get admitted. But what about people who have the disease and don't have any symptoms? So it could be the person sitting next to you at work. It's interesting. This is a study which was done in the UK last year, the Easter, looking at care homes. People in care homes, half of them were asymptomatic who tested positive. And the carers, doctors, nurses, not doctors, nurses, mainly the healthcare support workers, 1 out of 5 of them were not symptomatic. So you look at it, 1 is 10 to 30%. That means 1 to 3 out of every 10 people who have COVID will not show symptoms. That is important in the context of restrictions, masks, and vaccination, because you can transmit the disease even though you're not symptomatic. I'll tell you why I'm mentioning this at the last slide. Important for us to know that there are people who don't have symptoms, who don't even know that they have COVID, but they have had the COVID and they can transmit it to others. So, what are the objections to vaccination? I mean, if you think about various objections, I could put it as 4 big groups. The first is scientific objections. This is, well, we'll talk about that. The second is to do with ethics. It's not morally right to do some of these vaccines. Third, there are some religious reasons. And fourthly, there is a group which does not trust the government, doesn't trust pharmaceutical companies. There are reasons for all of this, I can understand, but mistrust of authority is the 4th big objection to vaccination. So we'll look at what they are. I would strongly recommend a paper with Roger and I wrote at the end of last year. It's a coronavirus pandemic and vaccines, a Christian viewpoint. So Roger gave us the initial bit about the spiritual side of things, or what should be the response of a Christian based on what the Bible says. And I looked at as simply as I could, and putting it into very simple layman's terms, what are the ethical objections? So I would strongly recommend, if you haven't read this, to read this paper. It is about 8 months old, but it is still valid today as it was then. And I would add that it is more valid today because we have lots and lots of more information, which actually vindicates, which actually says what we've said early in the pandemic was probably not wrong, or probably is right. So I would strongly recommend that. I'm not going to go into that paper. It carries lots, it has strong ethical reasons, 3 big ethical reasons why people would reject it, and I've countered it with some sensible discussions. So I think it's important to know this because I had a patient 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago even, a young man. He was in his 30s. He's got 3 children. So he was sitting there in my ward round that hadn't taken the vaccine. I must say, before I go down that route, that about 90% of the patients who are admitted now, certainly in the UK, have not had their vaccines. That is the third wave. And this young man was sitting there and he's got 2 children, and he was telling me, this vaccine has not been studied. I think we are being experimented on. Sadly for him, it was too late for him to have the vaccine because he has had the disease. And 3 days later, he was taken to intensive care. I do know that he did get better, but being in intensive care is not a pleasant experience. So what he told me was, there is no science behind it. So this is a very important thing which people keep talking about. So what do they say? Well, it's an old disease. The virus which causes this, the coronavirus, is a family of viruses which has existed for a long, long time, and it will come down on its own. Others say it may be a new disease, but it's only a flu. It's mild. And then the third group will say vaccines have not been well studied. And there's another group which says vaccines have side effects. And then the others will say nothing will happen to me because all these years I have not taken the flu vaccine and nothing should happen to me. So these are some of the common scientific objections. So what do I have to say about it? Yes, it's an old disease. It may decline on its own, but it's 20 months already. And we are still seeing peaks going up in countries which have even had 80% vaccination, such as Israel. So there are reasons for that. And vaccinations are not the cure, as you know, and the protection need not last long. So it's 20 months already. It's not an old disease. I think we are going to live with it for a long time. The others say it's a new disease, it's only a flu. Let me tell you, every year in winter, because I'm a chest doctor, I can speak with confidence that we see patients coming, elderly patients usually coming with the flu and dying. And flu kills. But the mortality, which means the number of people who can die, and the infectivity, which means how fast it can spread, it's almost 10 times as higher in all populations, old, young, middle-aged, everybody, than the common flu virus. So the important thing to notice, this does not respect age. Age, the flu virus used to kill mainly the elderly. I can tell you, sadly, I have seen very young people die. And you may have read about the pregnancy, because we did not have evidence for pregnancy. Pregnant women are young and fit and otherwise well. Quite a few pregnant women have died as well. They haven't died of the flu, or maybe they have, but it's very, very rare. The third thing is vaccines not well been studied. You know, some of the regulatory agencies that we have, like the MRHA, medicines and regulatory agents in the UK, the FDA in America, there is comprehensive evidence that this is effective. They have studied it quite extensively, and if you read my paper, they've done it at a huge scale, like it's never done before, because people were dying. And now we can look back and say the vaccines are much more effective than the flu vaccine. The lead of the Oxford vaccine he was saying, when they tried to develop a vaccine, they were hoping for an efficacy, that means it'll be effective in 60%. But the efficacy is higher than 85% for all vaccines, some even up to 95%. We won't go to that, but it's been well studied now. Vaccines have side effects. I've showed you some of the side effects. All vaccines have side effects. You know, if you take a vitamin C tablet, lots of vitamin C tablets, you can get kidney stones. Vitamin C is a vitamin. So every single drug, if you take a drug and look at the sheet which comes with it, it lists a lot of side effects. So does it stop us from taking tablets? The answer is no. Whenever you do something, it's a question of the side effects versus dying. Nothing will happen as I've not taken the flu vaccine. So that's what some people say. And all I can say is, if you look at the third wave, lots of people who said this are coming back. And it was very sad speaking to a family of a patient who are very clear that their mother did not want the vaccine for various reasons, but she died in our hospital. And it's very sad when you speak and say that you get to a point where you can't go back. So you can't say nothing will happen to me because I have not taken other vaccines, because as I said, this can kill more than the simple flu that you get every year. So those are the scientific objections. I can go on and on about any of these things, but I think this is not the time and the place. Secondly, you have the ethical objections to the COVID-19 vaccine. So what are those? It's there very clearly in the paper which you've written, but just to say the ethics of vaccine development. You know, we have two big groups, which is the new mRNA vaccine. People say it's new. And the AstraZeneca, which the ethical consideration was, when it first started, it was taken from an aborted fetus, somebody who had aborted a baby, and the cell lines came from that. So that is a big thing which is being used. The second thing is research protocols. That means, how was the study done? And thirdly, people said, oh, this is a big pharma gimmick. The pharmaceutical companies want to make money and we should not be helping them out. All of them are explained in detail, but just to say, the AstraZeneca vaccine does not contain any fetal material now. That's the first thing to say. The second thing is the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. They said it's you inject one of the what's called as the RNA into the body. It's going to get into your cell. It's going to make new things. You can become a totally different human being, and so on and so forth. The answer is no mRNA gets into the cell. It's destroyed well before that. So that's the ethics bit, and I'm just countering that. Research protocols, they said, oh, they did this study very quickly. Normally it takes 6 to 10 years to develop a vaccine, but they developed it in 3 to 4 months. The answer is it had to, because we had a problem. It was studied in big groups, and it's published in what's called as peer-reviewed and journals. And as I said, ratified by very sound regulatory bodies. Thirdly was the ethics of the commercial involvement. You know, all drugs that we have, cancer drugs, have pharmaceutical companies involved. They have research labs. You need funding. You cannot do research without funding. The best example is, you know, today we don't talk about tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, one of the main drugs in tuberculosis is called rifampicin. And that was developed by an American. It was developed by a scientist, a Hungarian scientist actually, who worked in America for an American company, which is a pharmaceutical company. And here we are many years down the line. We have, I wouldn't say TB under control, but people don't die like they died 50 years ago. And I'm going to add another question. My question is, what are the ethics? How are we going to answer ourselves, answer our families, answer our church, everybody we know, of rejecting something if things go wrong? I've called it the ethics of rejecting the good. It's not a definite ethical thing, ethical feature, but I think it's important for us to consider it. And I've written just over a page on it in my paper. Good to look at it. So those are the ethical objections. What are the religious objections to the vaccine? Now, very simply, two major religions, Islam and Judaism, they obviously, for them, pork and pork derivatives are not kosher or haram. And there's this big thing that vaccines contain pork and the gelatin is not halal. Unequivocally, the gelatin which is being used is not from the pork. So that's the first thing to say for people from Judaism and Islam. Sadly, some of the people who died, a lot of the people who died in this country, percentage-wise, were people who belong to the non-Caucasian, which is non-white groups. And a lot of them were not taking the vaccine because of this sort of message which comes across commonly through WhatsApp. What is the Christian religious objection? You may or may not have heard about lots of objections coming from all over the world. I wouldn't particularly say America, all over the world. People say it's interfering with God's will. This is the will of God. He sent this pandemic. It has to pass. Others say these are the last days. People say with the Pfizer, we are actually injecting the mark of the beast going inside. And there is this huge controversy about saying Bill Gates is trying to, decimate most of the population of the world. We won't go into that. I think, I always think about this. Jesus, come on, love your neighbor as yourself. I say this very sincerely because in the context of us saying that we believe this and that and the other, if we are part of the spread of a disease, then my question really is, do I love my neighbor? I leave that to you to answer. I don't have all the answers, but I'm just giving you this as food for thought. And finally, we have what's called as the mistrust of governments. There is this Black and Asian minority ethnic group in the UK. You have the Black Lives Movement and other things elsewhere. So inherently, they do not trust the government for a number of reasons. We won't go there. Some rightly, some wrongly. We won't go there. That's not the topic of our study and our workshop. But this group certainly mistrusts any big government objective or initiative because they feel it will work against them. Secondly, there are previous injustices, and one of the big things is what's called as a Tuskegee study. This sadly was a very bad, unethical study which was done in the United States and went on to as late as the mid-70s. And that was also approved by the FDA, the initial study in the 40s. And so the Black community, who were part of that study in the US and spreading across to here in the UK and the rest of the world, they feel that somehow they are being experimented on. And obviously, there are the aftershocks of slavery and various other things. So previous injustices. So just to say, when I wrote this paper, a colleague of mine who goes to a mixed church in London, where there are lots of black and black minority people in the congregation. So he said, Sam, how am I going to convince my congregation? And then finally he went ahead and said, the person who wrote this paper is not white, so can you please trust what is there? And sometimes we have to stand up and say, yes, injustices have happened in the past, but today this is looked at for everybody. So I think we should put aside our prejudices, put aside our, our inherent beliefs perhaps, and then look at it differently. And then there are perceptions, perceptions, it's saying that this is, anti-religion, and this is an anti-minority government agenda and so on. These are all perceptions. And finally, they have this big conspiracy theorists, isn't it? The anti-establishment group. They say that Bill Gates is the man behind it, and he's trying to take over the world. He's trying to decimate a lot of people. And others say it's like a Nazi-style experimentation. And then there is this big group which says, you're intruding into my personal freedom. I have the choice to take it. So these are the sort of mistrust that we have. I would just simply say, I think at some point, yes, our Lord is in control. Our Lord has given different people different abilities. And one of the groups that he himself was the great physician. I think at some point we need to trust and leave the rest to the God and think about the greater good. I'm going to stop there and see what questions you have. I can go on and on, but I thought I will just put those points across in your chat too. It shouldn't say RB, it should say Carol. So Carol, what are your questions? If you have any questions, and then we will talk about the 3 questions I put across. You're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the talk. It was a lot of information. I have basically one request for the paper which you wrote with Roger, and there is one question: if it is consistent to take medicaments for other illness but reject vaccines, which are medical intervention. So that would be one question.
I would agree entirely. If you can take medication, any medication, which has side effects, if you take ordinary antibiotics can have reactions. If you go to more, serious diseases like cancer, 2% of patients who take chemotherapy will die. But chemotherapy for cancer cures lots and lots and lots of people. 2% of people who have an open heart surgery or a cardiothoracic surgery will die. But if you need to get that operation, you will get it done. So everything has got a risk. But what you asked is, if you reject medicines, how can you reject this? I will ask the same question. I find it difficult when you can take a medicine and not take a vaccine for the very same reason. Both of them have got some benefit in health. Now, poliomyelitis has been cured in the UK. It is still there in fact, lots of the world. Smallpox, the last case we had was somewhere in 1975. The older generation will know about smallpox and how it used to kill. The one way to eradicate it was vaccination. We don't have it today.
Thank you. I have just following question with this, because some people might quote Psalm 103 that actually God heals all our sicknesses, and I think it's wrong interpretation of this verse, because He gave us with mind, and people can use their reason. So what would you tell to people who neglect vaccine in general? Because there are even people like this, and they wouldn't get any vaccine.
Okay. My job, and I think all our jobs, is to talk to people. Because when the vaccine first came out, there were lots of fears, this vaccine, specifically because it came very quickly. And I can tell you the number of questions I've had from friends, family, colleagues, patients, relatives about the vaccine. And certainly after reading the paper, lots of people have said, thank you. It has clarified so many misconceptions. The problem is in some places where people in authority, such as church leaders, such as even medical people. If you look at, anti-vaccine, if you Google it, you will get lots and lots of videos. You'll get lots and lots of things which people who are supposedly experts in the field will give their opinion. And sadly, there are some people who will believe it. For one, I think our job is to tell people, because people generally have fears. It's like anything else. When you talk to them, and I would say the vast majority understand, but a small percentage will not, and will not accept it. But that is something that's very difficult for you to convince a small group. But there are lots of people who have rightly fears. For example, I went on to at least 2 national webinars in the UK, specifically speaking to the Black and Asian minority communities, because there is the fear, and they would like to hear it from somebody who's seen it, who can speak with a reasonable authority, that their fears are not founded. Their fears are probably wrong. It's not something you need to be too worried about. And I always use this. If I cross the road, there's a good chance, or not good chance, there is a very small chance I can get hit by a truck. Okay. So what do? I look to the left and look to the right first. Make sure there's nothing coming. Yes. And I cross the road. There's a small chance that I can be hit by the truck, even if I look to the left and right. Somebody might come around the corner and might hit me. But I will still cross the road, because I need to cross the road for whatever I need to go to. And that's an easy way of explaining to people. If the chances of looking left and right, looking at the evidence, suggest that it's reasonably safe, or at least safer than not taking it, then we will cross the road. We will take the vaccine.
Okay, thank you. There is another question. Is there a moral case for compulsory vaccination?
I knew this question is coming. So at the end of the day, you can decide, and nobody can force you to take the vaccine unless you're living in a complete totalitarian state. But if you don't take the vaccine, there are things that you may not be able to do. For example, You may not be able to go to a different country because without vaccination, they may not accept you. That is the law of that country. It's like saying in the UK, I drive on the left side of the road. You can't drive on the right side of the road. In Europe, you drive on the right side of the road. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is, if I, as a doctor, if I have a disease called hepatitis, okay, it's a liver disease which is caused by a virus, and you can have what's called as hepatitis B or C positive. And if I'm a surgeon, then I have to tell the patient, first of all, if I don't have to operate, the suggestion is don't operate. But if I'm positive, then I may have to tell the patient that I do have it, and the patient can refuse, because I can give it from my blood. If I poke my finger by mistake, it can be, when I operate. So that's one thing. So there are some things which are not allowed for some people in certain positions. If you're a pilot, okay, and if you've had fits, then you can't fly for a certain period of time. If you've had a heart attack, you cannot drive for 6 weeks. That's a law of the land here, because you can have another heart attack, you may go and crash and kill somebody else. So there are some laws which restrict you when that causes harm to others. So from that perspective, yes, but will the government force a person to, without vaccinating, you're going to be locked up in prison? That is wrong. It's not there. You have personal choice at the end. But if your personal choice is going to cause harm to somebody else because of what you do, then you will have to ask yourself a serious question. Should I be doing that?
Okay, thank you. I have here the last question, which is a little bit maybe connected with this, with the understanding of the people. So what to say to the people who say that taking vaccine is a display of not enough faith?
So then I think we should stop all medication. There are some groups who don't take medication. And I personally, my dad is on the Zoom call today. We know a very close family friend who belong to they're very good believers, but they believe very firmly that if you have a disease, it's because the Lord has given you the disease, and that you shouldn't take any medication whatsoever. And we personally know 2 members of that family who have died unnecessarily for not taking the medication. So God puts different people in different places for very specific reasons. And I would just go back to what Jesus said: give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to the Lord what's the Lord's. But don't change, or don't put your own reading into what the Bible says.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a huge topic we could discuss a long time. I want to ask one final question, which is how actually deal this information which are like fake news, because as you said, the example of the AstraZeneca and the number of cases of people who were somehow in trouble compared to all who take vaccine, and the media can easily pick up just one case which went wrong, and like overwritten all the good effects. So what would be your recommendation how we should process such information?
I'm coming to that in a minute, but just to say 2 things. When we first started first started vaccinating patients, nobody talked about the number of people who have been or prevented from getting the disease. because that is something which we can't figure out. So how many have I prevented? All I can say is the numbers have come down. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm not sure if you've noticed, now that we are in the third wave, people are not talking about the side effects, but people are talking about the problems, or rather the media is talking about the problems of people who are not taking the vaccine. Have you noticed the new media is now just talking about this many people who have, at least here, people who have died, who were anti-vaccine people. So media can do all sorts of things, but it's useful. My second question will answer that. I'll just run through these things. So how does the church, I think we have a responsibility. First identify is the responsibility of elders, deacons, fellowship group leaders. You have to have conversations with people. You need to communicate with them. And I don't think we should avoid the issue. Let's not say that we don't have a responsibility. Let's not shirk as people in the church that we have a responsibility before God and for the people that He's put, in our sphere of influence. And the second thing is support. I think it's very important that we are not judgmental. There are people who have got reasons they've taken a vaccine. They know somebody who has died with a vaccine, not this particularly, other vaccines. So let's not be judgmental. Let's understand them. It's good to listen to concerns. I think it's important to point out to authoritative sources. Okay, so I'll talk about what that is. And finally, I think you need to use the Bible. And I think Roger's first bit in this paper is worth reading. What does the Bible say? It's worthwhile going back. For us, the basis is a scripture. And we need to go back to that. So that's the church leader. What about the individual? I think that's very important. We have to have 4 big tests. The information that you get, is it right? Scientifically, morally, spiritually. First ask, what is the source? Is it a right source? Is it a published source, or is it somebody's opinion? And secondly, the credibility of the source. The person who's saying it, what is his or her background? There was an American senator who was talking about a huge YouTube thing. Somebody sent it to me. What does the senator know? And he is moderating this with a bias. So the credibility. Thirdly, you need to put it in the balance. How does this information match up to evidence? You need to weigh it up. And most important, consider the consequences of yourself and others if you're following wrong advice. So I think you need to have these 4 tests. And finally, I think this is important as well. Non-judgmental, speak the truth in love for those who don't take it and those who take it. And I think we are the body of Christ, and each of us have our deficiencies and imperfections. We should recognize that. And as we need to stand alongside our brother and sister and talk, and that can help. And I think in the end, we should take a call and decide. The question of personal freedom versus greater good. And as I said right at the beginning, I think you need to love your neighbor as yourself. And I honestly, with all my heart, believe that to be the case. And what I've said today is, not based on my biases, but I've looked at the spiritual side and the evidence and the medical side. And I think I'm qualified to speak because I have been in the middle of it. And I think if you love your neighbor as yourself, especially because you can spread it, take the vaccine, is my honest feeling. So I will stop there. Stay safe.